So, would you mind telling me just a little bit about what your role is in the UMKC community? Are you a faculty member? And what is the department that you work with? It looks like you got a lot of rocks and things. So,
Yeah, my rocks give it away. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. So I am faculty. I'm still junior faculty, but like any day now, I should be finding out if I'm moving up to associate. Um, so I can talk about that early stage of being faculty, as well as I've been here long enough that I'm starting to feel not so new, but it's still kind of, I remember when I first got here trying to navigate through the campus community. And that's part of the reason I like being part of this group is like, I had wished when I arrived on campus, when I first got the job, that I knew there were other disabled faculty who wanted to talk about it and wanted to think about what our community should do and be more visible and all of that. I would have loved. I found Matthew by accident at some other talk that was talking sort of around disability. And I spoke up and he's like, well, I'm starting a thing. And I'm like, great.
that's awesome. So, you mentioned other disabled faculty. Are you yourself disabled, or what is your experience with disability to whatever extent you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to talk more about my own experiences because I see the impact it has for others. So I'm generally pretty open. So I identify as disabled is an interesting question. I would have what gets called a chronic illness. So I have lupus, which leads to a lot of being actually quite disabled. Like I can't open a door some days, or I can't leave the house and do much of anything. So today is actually an interesting day. I didn't want to leave the house. There was something I wanted to help with. And then it was, well, do I stay at work or not? And it's, a minute by minute decision of if I'm still able to do what I need to do today. And so I'm still doing okay. But yeah, I mean, some days you'd never know. So sometimes they call it an invisible disability, chronic illnesses, or neurodiversity as well tends to fall under that umbrella. So people will forget. And at the same time, I don't need people to think about it all the time, but it is relevant to planning, especially with travel or an event space or hours of commitment to something. And I always give myself way more buffer time than I actually need. And usually I just misrepresent what I need. And I always ask for extra time and then hope to be done early, because you never know what's going to change at the last minute and suddenly make things take longer.
Yeah. So along those lines, when you're requesting accommodations, for you, is this the experience like you request accommodations as if you're going to have your worst day every day, or how does that work? Do you feel like sometimes people expect you to be at a certain level because they've seen you do that before? Or do you feel like people are pretty understanding on what you need for accommodations on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's sort of difficult on a day-to-day basis because my colleagues and my students and even my spouse, they see me on my good days, as well as they probably see less of my struggle days because I tend to still just keep those to myself. I'll tell students what's happening, especially like, let's say we're in the field. So if I go somewhere with students for 3 weeks, we talk about it frankly up front, and then we have regular conversations. But then we go back to the office, they might totally forget. And so it is, I just make a point of when something's coming up, I ask a lot of questions about what the expectations are. And then if I need to adjust them, I do. But I've never actually asked for formal accommodations, discussed responsibilities and whether or not I'm the appropriate person for them, or what I would need if I'm going to take on something. And there is some flexibility as a faculty member for that. I guess the only time I did ask for anything was I didn't know what an autoimmune disease and COVID would be like, because I'm thankfully my maintenance of my disease doesn't require me to be on immunosuppressants. So I wasn't fully in that extreme category of concern, but my body reacts really weirdly to things. So if I have a mosquito bite, sometimes it can be my whole arm is completely inflamed and terrifying, and sometimes it's like, oh, it's normal, you know. So I didn't know what COVID would be like. And during that time period when all the formal requests about what you needed, I did say I wanted to be remote or have certain protections. And I was definitely very vocal, using the title of disability at that time as a tool to get what I needed to feel comfortable. But I did end up teaching in person quite early. I just masked, because I did tend to teach in really large classrooms. So it's not like they could lip read anyway. They were all pretty far away from me. And then anything that I needed to do where I wanted them to see my face, I did have more recordings and stuff like that mixed in. So, you know, in terms of accommodations, I have learned, for me, there would never be a one-size-fits-all accommodation. And I'm sure that's true for people dealing with any other disability, even if it's something that's more predictable. Because I try not to say it'll always be the worst. But the familiar with spoon theory?
Yes.
So I love the explanations of spoons for what I can do. And so I always, you know, maybe it's like, if I'm planning for worst case scenario, I tend to plan more at like 75% of my spoons are missing, rather than I'm totally laid out. And so the best way through that is time. So either, like, if I travel, I need recovery time afterwards so that I can be more functional. I used to fly red eyes before I started on this path. Like, I would teach the next day. Back when I was a PhD student, there's no way that would happen anymore. I mean, in old age, you know, people, as you get older, you can't do that stuff to your body anyway. But I, you know, if I did something that foolish, I'd be out for, you know, 4 days in a row rather than just one. And so that's my most common accommodations. I need more time, or I need some flex in when I do stuff. And really, in any other field, I wouldn't get that as often as I do here. So I'm lucky in that sense.
Just going back in time, I guess, a little bit, do you feel like there's a difference between the understanding of needing more time, like people being understanding of that need, as a grad student compared to a faculty member? Like, do you feel like there was a lot of pressure on you as a PhD student to match the other students' level without having to deal with or navigate chronic illness?
I mean, I definitely think there is a culturally undue pressure on graduate students to constantly compete. And there is a certain aspect to that. Once you're still a faculty member, it's still very competitive. And one of my colleagues was even talking about, like, in Europe, the way that they were looking back at the US system, and they're like, you guys, like, rank each other, you know, how am I doing relative to so and so constantly? And we do that to graduate students. And they just didn't understand it. They thought that was a strange way to do business. But interestingly, so I, in graduate school, was, I didn't have active lupus. I was completely unaware that this was in my future. And I did ridiculous things in terms of hours, in terms of expectations, in terms of cramming things into life, because I wanted everything, but also I thought I had to be successful. And that was definitely always supported, you know, reinforced by messaging from faculty. And it wasn't until I was a postdoc that I had a boss who believed in work-life balance. So that was really interesting to see the way he preserved home time for himself, and as a result thought it was for employees too, right? He sort of modeled it and then was perfectly comfortable with us setting those boundaries, and we sort of learned how to do it. It was really, if your job got done, he didn't care how you did it, and wanted everybody to have a bit of balance. And so then in the middle of that is when I got sick, when I first started having lupus show up, and that was when it was extreme. It was like I couldn't close doors, I couldn't walk. And I had a work environment where I didn't even think I needed to tell my boss if I needed more time, I could have it. And that was beautiful for me to like try and figure this out. And then I'm a scientist, so like I took data on what was going on with my body and then like pushed for a diagnosis. Like I went through that whole journey, and probably the best time in my career, except for the fact that I was looking for jobs. And I remember like doing interviews and trying to pretend I didn't have struggle opening round doorknobs, or that I was limping, or that I got home and I basically just collapsed on the bed and slept immediately. Like I had no time to prep for the next day. I just flung it for 2, and then afterward the interview, I'd be completely laid out.
Mm-hmm.
Where's it going with this? Oh, you're just talking about like grad school. And so as a result, now that I'm an advisor to students at all career stages, I saw my life go from my ability at one level to suddenly very cognizant of how inaccessible the world is and how inaccessible those expectations are that it is in everything I do with my students. I tell them about my own experience, and then I ask them to be verbal with me. I usually, I explain to them about spoons and let them use it. And I have, thinking of the diversity of my group, I have a higher than I think representative proportion of students who have some form of disability, physical, neurodiverse, mental health, and chronic illness. And there's like signs in my office that say, I think what is autoimmune disease, because the only thing tough enough to beat me up is me. Just put little things like that around my office, and then they all share. Think of how all the bosses they had that they never felt comfortable to have those conversations with. What would I have done if I had a boss I needed to talk to but didn't feel comfortable talking to? Like, so I'm trying to be supportive of my students, to connect them with resources, because we do have resources, right? And then talk to them about, well, how could they frame accommodations and things like that. So I want the culture to change about graduate school and that pressure. And I want everybody who wants to be involved in whatever scholarship they want to be there. So one of the most powerful things I have is I get to be a boss, and I get to create a work environment where those conversations feel safe, a work environment where we can adapt and people feel comfortable to ask what they need. Because if anything else, if I can teach them to be their own advocates, that might help them when they go to a work environment where that's not. But if they ever ask me about other bosses and people to work with, I tell them not to work with certain individuals. So that's the other thing, is to tell them, no, that person I don't think would be somebody you could communicate with, or that person does not care about your health. And through an able-bodied student to a student dealing with any disability or other challenges, child care responsibilities or family care, right? Like all those burdens that we take as humans. I do my best to say, that person has a bad track record. I don't recommend you work with them. Or this person has a great track record. And I try and facilitate those. And I've been able to see many students go to great work environments. And that's the biggest win. We'll see what we can do here too, but that, they can go to spaces I have less influence in and still get what they need.
Yeah. So in a way, you're encouraging accessibility, not only in your own field, but in the academic environment, through the environment that you create in your classroom and the way that you communicate openly with students, which I find is really great. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that you actually have a pretty decent amount of students who have some relationship to disability. And this is sort of a different question, but do you find that disability creates a unique perspective in your field? Like, I know as an artist myself, sometimes I'll be thinking about this person's art is definitely impacted in the way they experience life as a disabled person. Do you feel like that is relevant in your field? Like, do you feel like coming to your field as a disabled person causes you to think about things differently, whether that be through limitations or just because your perspective of the world is different?
I mean, absolutely. So I'm a geoscientist, I'm a geologist, and we do things in 3 dimensions, and you could even say 4 dimensions because we have time. And we deal with tactile things more than a lot of other fields. And we also deal with stuff you can't see. And so any different perspective comes in, any lived experience usually brings valuable insight. And specifically in terms of like instruction, something I'm actively working on is having more accessible instructions, but I'm a big adherent to accessibility improves the experience for everyone in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started and have been trying to include more instruction materials for those who are visually impaired. We had a student early on in my career here, and so we were sort of making stuff up as we went along, but I realized how much we had that was already there, that when I improved it for everybody. So a three-dimensional model of a molecule, right? Something that if we don't have really fragile ones from the 1970s, that's something tactile, and it's already including the information that's needed. So different molecules have different sizes. It's color coded for those who are visual, but we could find easy ways to cue in a difference with different textures. And topographic maps, which show topography, we use contour lines, so intervaled lines at different elevations. We also have them in 3D. So bringing those out for my student who is visually impaired was valuable to everybody in the room. Mm-hmm. We also were working on using fabrics to create, so like rock layers, we tend to put like, is it a little X, or if it's a V, if it's volcanic, or bricks for limestone. Like we have these known symbols. And so I started trying to make something that was magnetized, that I could change layers around, that had different fabric textures on them to represent these different textures. And that's still a work in progress, but thankfully the internet is full of people who are already trying to solve this problem. I'm not the first, and so I can leverage their expertise and experience to try and make these better tools. And then also, let's say I'm showing somebody who has no background experience whatsoever. That's just one more avenue for them to arrive. But then at the same time, when I speak to my students who might need these accommodations, they'll tell me what they need, and suddenly I've made something I never thought of that's also beneficial to everybody else in the room. Or they ask questions that the students who don't need that accommodation forgot to ask because it was somehow otherwise intuitive. And also, we're a very descriptive science in terms of like, I need to look at something, and some of my data is purely observational and qualitative. It's not all numbers. And the ability to be detail oriented, I find those who deal with any sort of disability are better at not forgetting something. They don't assume something is obvious to someone else. And that is really valuable in terms of sharing our observations, or even just making sure your evidence is really clear when you're making an argument about something. You don't leave something important out because you're like, well, of course everybody saw that it was blue. Well, was it blue? Let's talk about that. And yeah, so I mean, like, sometimes that perspective helps you skip obstacles others are dealing with, assuming that your instructor or your boss or whomever doesn't leave you stuck at the gate because something else simple that they could have accommodated stopped you from being in the room or being at the site. And so we also talk about disability, about ability, and that is something that I've personal insight to, and I think makes me to forget what accessibility for mobile and people dealing with mobility challenges. So we like to climb mountains. It's one of my favorite things to do. I've got volcanoes all over my wall back here. And when I first started, I thought my biggest barrier to success was going to be that I was female, because you had to be butch and up to the top, and you had to pee outside, and you had all these other barriers. And there was historical things about male project leads wouldn't give you time to use the bathroom. So you can think of all the reasons that that's challenging, from being female to dealing with any other health issue whatsoever. It becomes a health issue when you don't have access to the appropriate facilities or the appropriate time or privacy. I mean, you see how this starts working into identity and safety and all these other things that we struggle with field geology. And mobility is one of them. So some people still want to teach it that, well, if you can't make it to the top of the mountain to make observations, you're done, out. don't participate. It breaks my heart. So how do we bring the top of the mountain back? How does the student who can't make it to the summit of the mountain still contribute? Well, we have drones. We can have people with satellite images. So the really cool accessibility is we're using like walkie-talkies. So somebody does the hike, is up there sampling, and they can almost like pretend they're astronauts on the moon because that other person isn't there. So tell me what you see in your hand. And then they have satellite imagery and they're like, well, I know that you are X distance from other things that that person on the top might not have reached yet. And so they can go, you know, they can work in tandem. And it's, again, just like you said, perspective here versus perspective here. Suddenly we have a bigger picture than the person at the summit alone or the person remote, you know. And so how can we make these more comprehensive teams, leverage skills for learning? I need to invest in better microphones for outside speaking so that I can enable folks who are hard of hearing when it's windy, when there's trucks going by. Right? Like, I got my work cut out for me, but I want to do it. And I know I'm not the only person doing it. Maybe I'm the only one doing it here. But going back to the original question, 100% need those perspectives, need every perspective I can get, because we got a lot of challenges living on a planet that's going through a lot right now. And if we aren't including every voice, one, we're not helping everybody, and two, we're missing out on amazing insight into how do we solve these problems.
Wow, I love to
care about it. So sorry, I rant.
No, don't apologize at all. That was really enlightening for me to hear, because, you know, I only have my own perspective being involved in music, but I have no idea what accessibility or what the unique perspective of disability looks like in other fields. So that was super interesting for me to learn, and thank you so much for sharing all of that information. I guess one question that I do want to go back to now is navigating the job market as a disabled academic. Because now it's not necessarily that you've got an advisor who's pressuring you to do anything and everything as a grad student, and you don't have a boss telling you that you need to work a certain way. But in order to move to the next phase, it does take a lot of energy. I would assume, I'm still a student, but it would take a lot of energy to achieve a position. Do you feel like or what can you share about navigating the job market as a disabled academic? And do you feel like, especially with your perspective of invisible disability, is that something that maybe it was hard to disclose to potential employers?
Yeah, it's one of those, I can't give the best advice, because I did what I thought I needed to do to get the job I got, which was I did not disclose. And I mentioned earlier the struggles I had during the interview process. So for a professor position, it's usually 2 days of in-person on campus. Like every second you are on 30-minute meetings followed by 30-minute meetings. And a good host will remember to give you bathroom breaks, provide you snacks and, you know, whatever. So my solution was, like, I had snacks on my body because that's something that keeps me more pleasant, one, and two, you know, just keeping my energy up to make sure I didn't accidentally trigger a flare by, you know, not eating and getting into a really bad place. But I didn't disclose until I was here. And even then, I don't think the university formally has me ticked in the checkbox for disability. But I'm vocal with my colleagues about things, and when it's relevant in other community spaces, I'll bring it up. So I mean, like, that's always the big challenge, anything when you're looking for a job, is do I disclose or not? And some folks have no choice, right? They need accommodations from the get-go. And does suffering through things quietly give you a better edge? We're always scared to do that. And then it's what conversations are you comfortable having? But I will say some amount of transparency, you know, when you go to interview, not only are you being interviewed, but you are interviewing them. And I kind of wish for myself that I had been more open about my needs to because that would have told me so much about the different places.
Mhm.
And I landed at UMKC, and I don't think my colleagues would have said anything shocking during my interview that would have made me walk away, right? Like I think the challenges I deal in this workplace are not unique. There's nothing, particularly grievous, but if you walk into a place that they just don't want to work with you, you might save yourself some trouble. So sometimes transparency can be really important. Be your authentic self. I didn't rock up with dyed hair for that interview, but I was wearing punny t-shirts, and I wore things I was comfortable in, but also represented myself. And I told my stories and tried to be myself as much as possible, because that's who they would hire. And you pick a colleague for a while. But it's a balance, because it's terrifying. You're like, how much to disclose or not? And I'll admit, at the time, tangentially, I was more concerned about trying to find out if there was jobs here for my husband than about my own needs. And we do that too. Every human does that, right? They'll find us something to prioritize, and it might not be their own challenges. Because hey, we're used to muddling through with whatever we get. I'm going to have to make up my accommodations on the fly anyway. There's no, if you go to a employment office, at the time I was looking, which was only just 6 years ago, it's not that long ago, there wasn't anything on file, right? Like they wouldn't have had a box for what to do with somebody with a chronic illness like mine. Mine wasn't in the checkbox. Sometimes they do luck out, because lupus is one that's more known than some of the autoimmunes some of my my peers have had, where they're like, I don't know what that is, what's that called? And then you have to explain the whole thing. At least lupus, they go, oh, I've heard of that, and decades ago. But yeah, so I didn't, and that was something I could get away with. So sometimes the invisible disability lets you slide by, but I could have made my life harder by turning up into a workplace where you're SOL. But usually on an interview, you do get to talk to like HR, and this is true of a lot of jobs, so not just the university. You can contact their benefits office and ask things about what is your employee health, how do you approach that? Those are all valid questions, and strongly encourage people to ask them about, is paid time off? So faculty don't get this, but for other jobs, right? Like when I get time off versus sick leave, like are those commingled? Are they separate? And how does that work if I need more? Are we relying only on federal laws like the FMLA, what's that stand for? Family Medical Leave Act? Is that my only opportunity? So you have to do some research, because most places are unprepared. And so that is a burden. That's just this extra level of draining for whatever job you're looking for. You're looking at a university, you're looking at industry, government. Those things exist, but you have to go learn the acronyms before you get there, and then find the expert to ask them. So, I mean, it's exhausting for whatever you're trying to seek. Whether you're hiding it or being upfront. I mean, it's already a draining process. Looking for jobs is it's demoralizing. You get exhausted. Even for folks who find the right job right away, there's this formative aspect of it, and I'm making choices for the rest of my life. And then, hey, let's throw on a disability. Let's throw on a family care. Let's throw on even short-term illness. Right. And that's when a lot of people get to first experience what all the barriers are we have, or you need a wheelchair for 2 weeks. Suddenly you learn where all the paths are and how the campus is not designed well for that, or even just busting an elbow and suddenly being one-handed. What are you putting on? Hard, right? And suddenly we have these insights into what people's full lived experience constantly. So you just only the individual can, I guess, figure out how they're going to balance that. But if we all talk about it a bit more, it might be beneficial, right? I think there's improvement in those conversations. And I do think that there's a difference in the conversations we're having now, 6 years on from when I was looking for work, that there are more people who are prepared to be on the other side of that conversation. So I think there's some improvement. And one of the ways we've done that is through people talking about it. There's more celebrities now who talk about it, right? Like Selena Gomez has lupus. So that's actually, I've had that come up. Oh, that's what she has. Great. if that helps you talk to me better, I appreciate that she's willing to share. Now, granted, everybody's experience is different, and if they want us to all be mimics of who they know, humans. We aren't perfect. Even if somebody's like, oh, I know this one person who's visually impaired. Oh, but your impairment is different, or you're completely blind and they were only dealing with this minor bit. Surely you can. No, people have to get better at listening. But as long as the conversations are happening, I think that there is. It's getting easier isn't the right word, but the needs are being met more often because the conversations are happening.
Yes, I agree. Thank you again for sharing your insight. Is there anything that we haven't touched on in our discussion today that you would like to share? Maybe a closing thought, or it could be about what inclusion and accessibility mean to you. It could be any other advice, or if there's nothing, that's fine too.
Well, I just think the way to sum up, because I've obviously touched on a lot of topics, everything is interconnected. But when we are willing to look for those connections, and we are a more inclusive workplace, discipline, planet, that we all benefit from it. That's something that I have to remind folks a lot. And then if I've made something that's an accommodation for someone else, there's always this, well, what about everybody else? Okay, then let's plan it for everybody. Let's not make an accommodation that one person gets something. Let's actually rethink how we do something, because then it benefits all students, benefits all colleagues who use the space. There's this fear that there'll be, one or two people who cheat and take advantage of it. I don't care about them at all. Percentage is always low. The people who would abuse a system are such minor amounts to, I would hate to lose anybody who deserves to be there out of fear for one or two out of hundreds or thousands who would benefit. So I want us to stop having fear of accommodation being leveraged negatively, and say, let's actually make accommodation for everybody.
I agree. Yes, it's not an accommodation anymore when you create this space with everyone in mind, and everyone benefits from that.
We shouldn't need accommodations because we've designed everything better. That's what I want to see. And it takes a lot of constant labor. There's a lot of practice. So even somebody who is hyper aware, I still have work to do in my teaching style, in my presentations given. And so if we all just keep working on it, it will get better. Improvement is always a good thing to strive for, right? Why shouldn't we want to get better at doing stuff? That's talk progress. We should always want to do things better for more people.
Yes, agreed. Well, thank you again so much. This conversation was really enlightening, and I'm excited for more people to, in essence, become part of this conversation by hearing about your experience. Yeah, thank you.